John C. Calhoun was a South Carolina statesman and political theorist who became one of the most powerful and controversial figures in American history. John C. Calhoun, the 7th Vice President of the United States, was born in Abbeville District, South Carolina on March 18, 1782. He came from a Scots-Irish immigrant family. He had a commanding presence and piercing intellect. Calhoun's family owned a modest plantation. He was educated at local schools and then at Yale College, graduating in 1804. After studying law at the Litchfield Law School in Connecticut, he returned to South Carolina to practice law. Then in 1807, at the age of 25, Calhoun was admitted to the South Carolina bar and began his legal career in Abbeville. John C. Calhoun was a plantation owner and he owned slaves throughout his life. In 1811, Calhoun married his cousin Floride Bonneau Calhoun, and that same year he was elected to the United States House of Representatives. Calhoun quickly emerged as one of the leading war hawks, a group of young congressmen who pushed for war with Britain. He believed that American honor demanded a strong response to British interference with American shipping and the impressment of American sailors. Calhoun was a passionate nationalist in his early years, supporting the War of 1812 with Great Britain. The War of 1812 tested the young nation's resolve, and Calhoun was one of its most vocal supporters in Congress. He argued that America needed to defend its sovereignty and prove itself as an independent nation. After the war ended in 1815, Calhoun continued to champion nationalist policies. He supported the creation of the Second Bank of the United States, believing that a strong national bank would help stabilize the economy and promote growth. He also advocated for internal improvements, federal funding for roads and canals that would connect the growing nation. Calhoun supported protective tariffs to help American manufacturers compete with foreign goods. In 1817, President James Monroe appointed Calhoun as Secretary of War. Calhoun was only 35 years old, but he proved to be an exceptional administrator. He reorganized the War Department, improved military training, and strengthened coastal defenses. He established new procedures for procurement and accountability. He worked to professionalize the officer corps and created a system of military schools. Calhoun's tenure as Secretary of War lasted 8 years, and he was widely regarded as one of the most effective cabinet members of the era. During his time as Secretary of War, Calhoun oversaw the Seminole Wars in Florida and the expansion of American military posts in the West. He dealt with the complex challenges of managing relations with Native American tribes as white settlement pushed westward. He supported the removal of Native Americans from their ancestral lands, viewing it as necessary for American expansion. Calhoun believed that the growing United States needed a strong military establishment to protect its interests and secure its borders. In 1824, Calhoun ran for president but withdrew from the race when it became clear he could not win. Instead, he accepted the vice presidency, serving under John Quincy Adams from 1825 to 1829. The relationship between Adams and Calhoun was strained from the beginning. They disagreed on fundamental issues of policy and political philosophy. Calhoun began to drift away from his earlier nationalism and started developing theories about states' rights and the nature of the Federal Union. The turning point in Calhoun's political evolution came with the Tariff of 1828, which Southerners called the Tariff of Abominations. This protective tariff raised duties on imported goods to protect Northern manufacturers, but it hurt Southern planters who had to pay higher prices for manufactured goods and feared retaliation against their cotton exports. Calhoun, now representing Southern interests, was outraged by what he saw as Northern economic aggression against the South. In 1828, Calhoun secretly wrote the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, a document that laid out the theory of nullification. Calhoun argued that states had the right to nullify federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. He believed that the Constitution was a compact among sovereign states, and that states retained the ultimate authority to judge whether the federal government had exceeded its powers. This theory would become the foundation of his political philosophy for the rest of his life. Calhoun was re-elected as vice president in 1828, this time serving under Andrew Jackson. Initially, Calhoun hoped that Jackson would support Southern interests and oppose high tariffs. But the relationship between Jackson and Calhoun deteriorated rapidly. The Petticoat Affair, a social scandal involving the wife of Secretary of War John Eaton, created tension within the administration. Calhoun's wife Flo Ride led the social ostracism of Peggy Eaton, and Jackson never forgave Calhoun for this treatment of his friend's wife. More seriously, Jackson discovered that Calhoun, while serving as Secretary of War, had advocated for disciplining Jackson for his unauthorized invasion of Spanish Florida in 1818. This revelation destroyed any trust between the two men. Jackson felt betrayed by Calhoun's duplicity. The president began to favor Martin Van Buren, his Secretary of State, as his successor rather than Calhoun. The break between Jackson and Calhoun became complete during the Nullification crisis of 1832 and 1833. South Carolina, following Calhoun's theories, declared the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832 null and void within the state's borders. The state threatened to secede from the Union if the federal government tried to collect the tariffs by force. Jackson was furious and viewed nullification as treason. He declared that the Union must be preserved and threatened to send federal troops to South Carolina to enforce the law. Calhoun resigned as vice president in December 1832, the first vice president ever to resign from office. He immediately took a seat in the United States Senate, where he could more effectively defend South Carolina's position. The crisis was eventually resolved through a compromise tariff negotiated by Henry Clay, which gradually reduced tariff rates over 10 years. South Carolina rescinded its nullification ordinance, and Jackson backed down from his threat of military force. But the underlying tensions between North and South remained unresolved. As a senator, Calhoun became the leading spokesman for the South and the institution of slavery. He abandoned any pretense of nationalism and devoted himself entirely to defending Southern interests and the Southern way of life. He argued that slavery was not a necessary evil but a positive good, beneficial to both masters and slaves. He claimed that slavery provided a stable social order and that enslaved African Americans were better off than free workers in the North. These arguments were morally reprehensible, but they reflected the views of many Southern planters who felt increasingly defensive about their peculiar institution. Calhoun developed a sophisticated political theory to defend minority rights, by which he meant the rights of the slaveholding South. He argued for the concept of concurrent majority, the idea that major policy decisions should require the consent of all major interests in society, not just a numerical majority. He believed that the numerical majority of the North would use its power to oppress the South unless constitutional safeguards protected minority rights. He saw the federal government as a threat to Southern autonomy and state sovereignty. Throughout the 1830s and 1840s, Calhoun was at the center of every major political controversy involving sectional tensions. He opposed the abolition movement and any efforts to restrict the expansion of slavery into new territories. He argued that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories and that slaveholders had a constitutional right to take their property, including slaves, anywhere in the United States. He viewed any attempt to limit slavery as an attack on the South and a violation of constitutional principles. Calhoun briefly served as Secretary of State under President John Tyler from 1844 to 1845. In this role, he worked to annex the Republic of Texas to the United States. He negotiated the Treaty of Annexation and argued that bringing Texas into the Union was essential for Southern security and the expansion of slavery. He feared that if Texas remained independent or fell under British influence, it might abolish slavery and become a haven for runaway slaves. The annexation of Texas was controversial because it would upset the balance between free and slave states, but it was accomplished in 1845. As Secretary of State, Calhoun also dealt with tensions with Great Britain over the Oregon Territory. He advocated for American expansion but was willing to compromise with Britain to avoid war. He believed that the South's interests were better served by focusing on southwestern expansion into Texas and potentially Mexico rather than northwestern expansion into Oregon. After James K. Polk became president in 1845, Calhoun returned to the Senate. The Mexican-American War, which began in 1846, created new controversies over slavery expansion. Calhoun supported the war initially but became concerned about its implications. When Representative David Wilmot proposed the Wilmot Proviso, which would have banned slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico, Calhoun led the Southern opposition. He argued that Congress had no authority to exclude slavery from the territories and that doing so would violate the rights of Southern citizens. The Wilmot Proviso passed the House but failed in the Senate, largely due to Calhoun's efforts. Calhoun's health began to decline in the late 1840s. He suffered from tuberculosis and was often too ill to attend Senate sessions. But he remained intellectually active and continued to write and speak about the constitutional issues that consumed him. He worked on his political treatises, including a disquisition on government and a discourse on the Constitution and government of the United States, which laid out his mature political philosophy. These works argued for strict constitutional limits on federal power and the protection of minority interests through constitutional mechanisms. In 1850, the nation faced another crisis over slavery with the debate over the Compromise of 1850. California sought admission as a free state, which would upset the balance between free and slave states in the Senate. Other issues included the organization of the New Mexico and Utah territories, the Texas boundary, the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and a stronger fugitive slave law. The debate over these measures was intense and bitter, with sectional passions running high. Calhoun was too weak to deliver his own speech during the Great Senate debate in March 1850. His colleague Senator James Mason of Virginia read Calhoun's address while the dying statesman sat wrapped in blankets, watching from his Senate seat. In his final speech, Calhoun warned that the Union was in danger of dissolution. He argued that the North had destroyed the equilibrium between the sections through its opposition to slavery expansion and its support for abolition. He demanded guarantees for Southern rights and the return of fugitive slaves. He rejected the compromise measures as inadequate to protect Southern interests. Calhoun's speech was a grim prophecy of the sectional conflict to come. He argued that the bonds holding the Union together were snapping one by one. He said that the North and South had become two peoples with different interests, different values, and different civilizations. He warned that unless the North made concessions to protect slavery and Southern rights, the South would have no choice but to leave the Union. He called for constitutional amendments to protect the South, including a dual executive with one president from the North and one from the South, each with veto power over legislation. 3 days after his speech was read, Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts delivered his famous 7th of March speech, calling for compromise and preservation of the Union. Webster's speech was a response to both Calhoun and to Northern abolitionists. Webster argued that the Union must be preserved and that both sections needed to make concessions. His speech was controversial in the North, where many viewed it as a betrayal of anti-slavery principles, but it helped pave the way for the Compromise of 1850. Calhoun did not live to see the outcome of the debate. On March 31, 1850, John C. Calhoun died in Washington, D.C. at the age of 68. His last words were reported to be about the South and the Constitution, the two causes that had dominated his later life. He died believing that the South's rights were being trampled and that the Union he had once championed was doomed unless fundamental changes were made. His death marked the end of an era in American politics. The Compromise of 1850 was eventually passed after Calhoun's death, largely through the efforts of Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas. The compromise temporarily eased sectional tensions, but it did not resolve the fundamental conflict over slavery. The issues that Calhoun had raised continued to divide the nation. Within a decade, the country would be plunged into civil war, fulfilling Calhoun's dire predictions about the dissolution of the Union. John C. Calhoun's legacy is complex and deeply controversial. He was one of the most brilliant political theorists America has produced, but he used his intellect to defend the indefensible institution of slavery. He was a masterful debater and a powerful orator who shaped the political discourse of his time. His theories about states' rights, nullification, and minority protections influenced Southern thinking for generations. His ideas provided the intellectual foundation for secession and the Confederacy. Calhoun's defense of slavery as a positive good was morally wrong and caused immense human suffering. His arguments that enslaved people were better off in bondage were self-serving rationalizations that ignored the brutal reality of slavery. His political philosophy, while sophisticated, was ultimately deployed in service of maintaining a system of racial oppression. The South that he defended was built on the labor of millions of enslaved African Americans who were denied their freedom, their dignity, and their humanity. Yet Calhoun's influence on American political thought cannot be denied. His ideas about federalism, states' rights, and the limits of majority rule continue to resonate in American politics. His concept of concurrent majority, while developed to protect slavery, raised important questions about how democratic systems can protect minority interests without being paralyzed by minority vetoes. His warnings about sectional conflict and the fragility of the Union proved prophetic, even if his proposed solutions were unacceptable. Calhoun served in Congress for over 30 years, in both the House and Senate. He served as Secretary of War for 8 years and Secretary of State for 1 year. He was Vice President for nearly 8 years under 2 different presidents. Few American politicians have held such high offices for so long or wielded such influence over national affairs. He was part of the Great Triumvirate along with Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the 3 senators who dominated American politics in the second quarter of the 19th century. Throughout his career, Calhoun was known for his logical mind and his ability to construct elaborate constitutional arguments. He was not a warm or charismatic figure like Clay, nor was he a spellbinding orator like Webster. But he was respected, even by his opponents, for his intellectual rigor and his unwavering commitment to his principles. He was described as having an intense, almost fanatical devotion to his ideas. He pursued his arguments to their logical conclusions without regard for political expediency or popular opinion. Calhoun's transformation from nationalist to sectionalist reflected the changing politics of the antebellum era. In his youth, he had supported a strong federal government and national economic development. But as sectional tensions grew and the South felt increasingly threatened by Northern political and economic power, Calhoun became the champion of Southern rights and limited government. This evolution was not unique to Calhoun. Many Southern leaders underwent similar transformations as they came to see the federal government as a threat rather than a protector of their interests. The tragedy of John C. Calhoun was that his considerable talents were devoted to defending an evil institution. Had he used his intellect and political skills to promote justice and human freedom, he might be remembered as one of America's greatest statesmen. Instead, he is remembered as the most articulate defender of slavery and the prophet of disunion. His legacy is forever tainted by his association with the cause of slavery and his role in pushing the nation toward civil war. When Calhoun died in 1850, he was mourned throughout the South as a hero and champion of Southern rights. His funeral in Charleston, South Carolina, was attended by thousands of people who viewed him as a martyr to the Southern cause. In the North, his death was noted with respect for his abilities but relief that his divisive voice had been silenced. The nation's leaders recognized that Calhoun had been a formidable opponent and a major obstacle to sectional compromise. In the years after his death, Calhoun's ideas continued to influence Southern political thought. His theories about states' rights and nullification were cited by secessionists as justification for leaving the Union. The Confederate Constitution incorporated some of his ideas about limiting federal power and protecting states' rights. Southern leaders during the Civil War and Reconstruction invoked Calhoun's name and his principles as they fought to preserve and then to restore white supremacy. John C. Calhoun was a man of his time and his region, but he was also a unique figure whose influence extended far beyond his lifetime. He was a brilliant political theorist who used his gifts to defend an immoral system. He was a powerful senator who shaped national policy for decades. He was a prophet who warned of civil war and disunion, even as his own actions helped bring about the catastrophe he predicted. His life and career illuminate the deepest contradictions and conflicts of antebellum America, a nation divided between the ideals of liberty and the reality of slavery.